Some secrets are not hidden because they are shameful. They are hidden because they can change the way someone loves you forever. Those words would echo in Emily Brooks's heart long after the happiest day of her life had come to an unexpected pause. The evening had unfolded exactly as every guest had hoped. Soft, golden lights stretched across the old white barn where friends and family had gathered to celebrate a wedding that felt wonderfully simple. Laughter drifted through the cool autumn air. Children chased one another across the wooden dance floor. Fresh flowers rested on every table beside glowing candles that flickered gently beneath strings of warm lights. Emily could still hear the final notes of their first dance as she and Ethan Carter quietly slipped away from the celebration. They had chosen a small country inn nearly 20 miles outside town instead of an expensive honeymoon resort. That decision sounded exactly like Ethan. Practical. Quiet. Uncomplicated. Emily loved him for that. He had never tried to impress her with money, expensive gifts, or promises that sounded too perfect to believe. He fixed engines 6 days a week at Miller's Auto Repair. His hands carried small marks left by years of honest work. He drove an old pickup truck that rattled every time it reached 60 miles per hour. Yet every morning he brought coffee to an elderly neighbor before opening the garage, and every Friday he quietly repaired at least one customer's car without charging labor if he knew they were struggling. Emily had watched him do countless kind things without ever mentioning them afterward. That was the man she had fallen in love with. As they entered the quiet room waiting for them at the inn, Ethan carefully closed the door behind them. Outside, the distant sounds of celebration slowly disappeared beneath the peaceful rhythm of crickets and a gentle evening breeze. Emily removed her shoes with a tired laugh and looked around the cozy room. A small fireplace glowed softly. Fresh flowers stood beside the window. Their luggage rested near the bed exactly where the innkeeper had placed it. Everything felt calm. Safe. Familiar. Ethan smiled at her with the same gentle expression she had seen since the day they first met beside his repair shop after her aging sedan refused to start. He had fixed the problem in less than 15 minutes, accepted only the exact amount listed on the invoice, and wished her a wonderful afternoon without asking for anything else. Months later she returned simply to thank him. That conversation lasted 3 hours. Tonight she expected nothing more than the beginning of the ordinary life they had dreamed about together. Ethan slowly walked toward an old leather duffel bag resting beside the dresser. He knelt quietly and unzipped one of the side compartments. From inside he carefully lifted a small wooden box no larger than a family Bible. The wood had darkened with age. Tiny scratches covered every corner. Brass hinges reflected the warm firelight, revealing that someone had opened and closed it many times over many years. Ethan held the box with both hands for several silent moments before placing it gently on the table between them. Emily noticed something she had never seen before. His hands, usually so steady while rebuilding an engine, trembled ever so slightly. She looked into his eyes and immediately realized this was not an anniversary gift or a keepsake from childhood. This was something far heavier. Ethan took a slow breath before meeting her gaze. His voice remained calm, yet carried a weight she had never heard before. "Before we become husband and wife in every sense," he said quietly, "there is one truth you deserve to know. I should have told you long before today, but I needed to know that you chose me before you ever knew my story." Emily felt her heartbeat quicken as her eyes drifted from Ethan's face to the weathered wooden box resting silently between them, wondering how something so small could suddenly make the happiest night of her life feel as though it stood on the edge of an entirely different beginning. Emily looked at the weathered wooden box without reaching for it. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the room, casting warm light across the old brass hinges as silence settled between them. Ethan rested one hand gently on the lid but did not open it. Instead, he offered a faint smile that carried more nervousness than confidence. "Before you see what is inside," he said quietly, "there are things you need to understand first." Emily slowly nodded. She trusted him completely, yet she had never seen him struggle to find words. The moment felt too important to interrupt. Ethan drew a slow breath and looked toward the window where the moonlight stretched across the quiet countryside. Do you remember the first time we met? Emily smiled despite the uncertainty now filling the room. Of course I do. Her mind drifted back nearly 2 years earlier. Her aging sedan had broken down less than 3 miles outside the small town where she had recently accepted a position as a second-grade teacher. She remembered standing beside the road on a hot summer afternoon, while every passing vehicle hurried by without stopping. Then an old pickup truck pulled onto the shoulder. A tall mechanic climbed out, wiped his hands on a clean shop towel, and politely asked whether she would mind if he took a quick look under the hood. That man was Ethan Carter. Within 15 minutes the engine was running again. When Emily tried to hand him extra money, he counted only the exact repair costs printed on the invoice before returning the rest. "Keep it," he had said with an easy smile. "You might need it more than I do." She remembered driving away thinking that honest people like him were becoming difficult to find. A week later she returned to the repair shop carrying homemade blueberry muffins simply to thank him. They shared coffee during his lunch break. One conversation became another. Coffee became weekend walks. Walks became quiet dinners at small family restaurants. Nothing about their relationship happened quickly. Ethan never tried to impress her with expensive dates or dramatic promises. He simply showed up every time he said he would. He listened more than he spoke. When Emily's mother slipped on icy porch steps one winter morning, Ethan quietly repaired the broken railing before sunrise without sending a bill. When a young single father brought an old truck into the garage with barely enough money to buy groceries, Ethan stayed late repairing the transmission and quietly told his assistant to write "paid in full" across the invoice. Emily discovered those moments only because grateful people occasionally mentioned them. Ethan never did. There was one subject, however, that always remained just beyond reach. Whenever conversations drifted toward childhood memories, family gatherings, or old photographs, Ethan gently redirected the discussion. If friends asked where he grew up, his answers were always short. "Around here." If someone asked about his parents, he simply smiled and changed the subject. Emily respected his privacy. Everyone carried old wounds. She believed that love did not require knowing every painful chapter immediately. Still, small details quietly accumulated over time. Ethan never celebrated his birthday. There were no family pictures hanging inside his modest farmhouse. The shelves held repair manuals, classic novels, and history books, but not a single photo album. The only personal object he guarded carefully was the same weathered wooden box now resting on the table between them. Once, while helping organize a closet, Emily had accidentally reached toward it. Ethan had not become angry. Instead, he had gently picked it up, smiled apologetically, and whispered, "One day I will show you everything inside. I promise. Just not today." She had never asked again. During their engagement, Emily occasionally noticed older members of the community greeting Ethan with unusual warmth. The town pastor embraced him like family. A retired firefighter always shook his hand with deep respect. Even Judge William Harper, a man known for his reserved personality, once crossed an entire parking lot simply to thank Ethan for something neither of them explained. Whenever Emily asked what had happened, Ethan answered with the same quiet smile. "Just an old story." Tonight, sitting across from the man she had just married, Emily suddenly realized every unanswered question pointed toward the small wooden box resting between them. Whatever truth Ethan had carried alone for so many years was no longer waiting somewhere in the future. It had finally arrived, and she could see in his eyes that opening the lid would not simply reveal old papers. It would reveal the life he had never allowed anyone, including the woman he loved most, to fully understand. For several long moments neither of them spoke. The only sound inside the quiet room came from the soft crackle of burning firewood and the distant rustling of oak trees outside the window. Ethan slowly rested both hands on the worn wooden box as though he had carried its weight far longer than its size could possibly explain. Emily reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. "You do not have to be afraid," she whispered. Ethan looked at her with grateful eyes before giving a faint smile. "I am not afraid that you will leave," he answered softly. I am afraid that once you know everything, you will realize you married someone very different from the man you believed you knew. Emily slowly shook her head. The man I married is the one who fixed an elderly widow's truck without charging her because she needed medicine more than car repairs. He is the one who carried groceries into Mrs. Henderson's house every Saturday after church without telling anyone. He is the one who stayed 3 extra hours helping a young couple get back on the road so they could make it to the hospital before their daughter was born. Whatever happened before I met you cannot erase the man sitting in front of me now. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. I hope you still feel that way after tonight. His fingers gently traced one corner of the old box before he quietly pushed it a few inches closer toward Emily. She noticed that the brass latch had become smooth from years of careful use. Someone had opened it hundreds of times, yet never casually. Every movement Ethan made suggested reverence rather than habit. Emily remembered dozens of small moments she had ignored over the past 2 years because love had taught her not to pry into wounds that someone was not ready to share. There had been the afternoon she found Ethan sitting alone beneath the giant maple tree behind the repair shop, staring silently at the wooden box resting beside him. When she asked whether everything was all right, he simply smiled and asked whether she wanted to join him for ice cream after work. Another time she had noticed him reading a faded handwritten letter before quietly returning it to the box as soon as footsteps approached. During Thanksgiving dinner at her mother's house, relatives spent hours exchanging childhood stories that filled the room with laughter. Ethan listened politely, smiling whenever everyone else laughed, yet he never contributed a memory of his own. Emily assumed he simply preferred listening. Looking back now, she realized he had never possessed those kinds of stories to share. Even birthdays always felt strangely ordinary with him. He insisted on spending the day helping at the community food pantry before accepting a simple homemade dinner. He never wanted presents. He never requested cake. When Emily once asked which birthday had been his favorite as a child, he paused just long enough for her to notice before quietly replying, "Every New Year has been a gift." At the time she thought it was simply another example of his humble personality. Now every unanswered question seemed connected by invisible threads leading toward the weathered box resting between them. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair. "There is something else you should know before I open it," he said. "Everything inside was given to me by one person. He made me promise that I would never show anyone until I found someone who loved me for the life I built instead of the life I inherited." Emily frowned slightly. "Who gave it to you?" Ethan looked toward the glowing fireplace, his expression growing distant as though he could see another place many years away. "Judge William Harper." Emily blinked in surprise. The respected judge had attended their wedding earlier that afternoon, congratulated them warmly, and quietly hugged Ethan longer than anyone else. She remembered thinking it seemed unusual that a retired judge would travel nearly 100 miles simply to celebrate the marriage of a small-town mechanic. Ethan continued speaking softly. "He has protected this secret almost my entire life." Emily searched his face, trying to understand. "My mother always said he treated you almost like family." Ethan gave a slow nod. "In many ways, he became the closest thing I ever had." The room grew silent once again. Emily realized that every mystery surrounding Ethan was no longer scattered across unrelated moments. They were pieces of one story waiting to be assembled. She looked down at the old wooden box, noticing for the first time a tiny brass nameplate secured beneath years of careful polishing. The engraved letters had almost disappeared with age, but under the warm glow of the fire she could just make out a single word carved into the metal. It was not Ethan's name. It was another family name entirely, one she had never heard him mention before, and before she could ask what it meant, Ethan slowly lifted his hand toward the ancient brass latch, knowing that once it opened, either of their lives would ever look the same again. Emily kept her eyes on the faded brass nameplate, while Ethan rested his fingers lightly against the worn latch. Either of them hurried the moment. It felt as though the room itself understood that once the lid opened, there would be no returning to the quiet mystery that had surrounded their life together. Ethan looked at her with the same gentle expression that had first earned her trust beside a broken-down sedan nearly 2 years earlier. "There is one thing I have never wanted," he said softly. "I never wanted anyone to see these papers before they truly knew me." Emily answered without hesitation. "I know you." Ethan smiled sadly. "You know the man I became. Tonight you are about to meet the boy I used to be." He slowly released the brass latch, but instead of opening the box, he paused again. His eyes drifted toward the window where the moonlight washed across the quiet fields beyond the inn. "Do you remember the old courthouse fundraiser last spring?" Emily nodded immediately. The town had gathered to restore the historic courthouse after years of weather damage. Volunteers painted fences, cleaned gardens, and organized donations while local businesses contributed supplies. Ethan had spent nearly an entire weekend repairing antique maintenance equipment without accepting payment. She remembered Judge William Harper arriving unexpectedly that afternoon. The retired judge had walked directly toward Ethan, placed one hand gently on his shoulder, and thanked him with unusual sincerity. The conversation lasted only a minute, yet both men looked as though they shared memories reaching back decades. When Emily later asked how long they had known each other, Ethan simply smiled and replied, "Long enough to owe him more than I can ever repay." At the time she accepted the answer. Looking back now, she realized it had explained nothing. There had been other moments as well. Whenever older residents visited the repair shop, they often greeted Ethan with a warmth that seemed deeper than ordinary friendship. Veterans invited him to Memorial Day breakfasts. Church elders always saved him a seat during community dinners. A retired firefighter once embraced him after a parade and quietly whispered, "Your father would be proud." Ethan never corrected the man, but neither did he explain what those words meant. Emily had assumed it referred to someone who had mentored him years earlier. Another memory suddenly returned with surprising clarity. One rainy afternoon, Emily had arrived at the garage carrying lunch for Ethan. She found him speaking with an elderly woman she had never met before. The woman thanked Ethan through tears before handing him a folded handwritten note. After she drove away, Emily asked who she was. Ethan looked at the note for several long seconds before placing it inside the wooden box. "Someone who finally found peace," he answered quietly. Emily had never pressed for details because she respected the invisible boundaries he carried around certain parts of his life. Now every conversation, every unexplained smile, every carefully chosen answer seemed connected by threads she simply had not recognized. Ethan rested one hand on top of the wooden box once more. "Judge Harper always told me that secrets should never become foundations for marriage," he said. "He believed truth belongs before tomorrow begins." Emily reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "Whatever is inside this box," she whispered, "it has already lived with you for many years. You do not have to carry it alone anymore." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, taking comfort from her words. When he looked at her again, there was gratitude mixed with quiet sorrow. "There are letters in here," he said. "Documents. Newspaper clippings. A birth certificate. And one promise that changed the direction of my entire life." Emily listened without interrupting. "The promise was simple," Ethan continued. "I was told that if I ever found someone who loved the mechanic more than the mystery, then I could finally tell the whole story." Emily felt her heart tighten. She realized this conversation had never been about doubt. It had always been about trust. Ethan had not hidden the truth because he wanted to deceive her. He had protected it because he feared the story might become more important than the man himself. Outside, a cool breeze stirred the trees beneath the moonlit sky while the last distant sounds of the wedding celebration disappeared into the quiet countryside. Ethan finally lifted the lid only an inch before stopping once more. Resting on top of the neatly organized contents was a yellowed envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting faded by nearly 4 decades, were 7 words that caused Emily to stop breathing for a single unforgettable moment. "To Ethan Carter, when you are finally ready." Emily looked from the sealed envelope to Ethan's face, searching for some clue that might prepare her for whatever waited inside. Instead, she found only quiet honesty. The firelight reflected softly across his eyes as he carefully lifted the envelope from the wooden box with both hands. Beneath it rested several neatly arranged documents tied together with a faded blue ribbon, but he left them untouched. "This letter comes first," he said gently. "Judge Harper always told me that if I ever opened this box in front of someone I loved, the letter had to be read before anything else." Emily nodded silently. Ethan ran his thumb across the old wax seal, hesitating for only a moment before breaking it with careful hands. The paper inside had yellowed with age, and the elegant handwriting flowed across every line with remarkable precision. He unfolded the letter slowly, taking a quiet breath before beginning. "Dear Ethan," he read softly, "if you are holding this letter, then you have finally found someone you trust more than your fear. That means I have kept my promise long enough." Ethan stopped reading for a moment, his voice growing unsteady. Emily gently reached across the table and rested her hand against his arm. He smiled gratefully before continuing. "You have spent your life believing that your greatest responsibility was to protect this story until the right moment. If that day has arrived, then you must also know that the truth was never meant to become a burden. It was meant to become your freedom." Ethan lowered the letter slightly. "Judge Harper wrote this almost 20 years ago," he explained quietly. "He updated only one page before giving it to me for the last time." Emily listened without interrupting. Ethan continued reading. "The woman sitting beside you deserves honesty because she chose your character before she ever knew your history. Never allow your past to convince you that you must hide from the people who truly love you." Tears quietly gathered in Emily's eyes. She had never met the judge well enough to understand why he cared so deeply about Ethan, yet every word carried the warmth of someone who had watched a child become a good man. Ethan carefully folded the first page aside and revealed another sheet hidden beneath it. Unlike the elegant handwriting, this page had been typed many years earlier. Judge Harper had signed it at the bottom. Ethan's expression grew thoughtful. "This is the part that frightened me," he admitted. Emily squeezed his hand gently. "Whatever it says, we will face it together." Ethan looked at her for several long seconds before giving a grateful nod. He unfolded the page and quietly read the opening sentence. "When you were only a few hours old, a mistake was made that changed several lives forever." Emily felt her heartbeat quicken, but she remained completely silent. Ethan continued. "You were placed into the care of the wrong family after your birth. By the time the error was discovered, circumstances had become so complicated that the court sealed every official record until the truth could be responsibly verified." Ethan lowered the page and closed his eyes briefly. "That is where my story truly begins." Emily stared at him in disbelief, not because she questioned his words, but because she suddenly understood why every conversation about family had ended with silence. Ethan had never been hiding shame. He had been protecting a lifetime of unanswered questions. He slowly reached into the wooden box and carefully lifted the blue ribbon that held the remaining documents together. Beneath it rested an original birth certificate, several legal records, newspaper clippings dating back nearly 4 decades, and photographs that had clearly been preserved with extraordinary care. Emily noticed that every document carried official seals and signatures. Nothing looked uncertain or incomplete. Judge Harper had spent years protecting evidence instead of rumors. Ethan placed the ribbon bundle gently on the table but did not untie it. "Everything you need to understand is here," he whispered. "The records explain what happened. The letters explain why. But there's one person still living who knows every detail better than any document ever could." Emily slowly looked up. "Judge Harper." Ethan nodded. "He asked me to call him only after I finally shared the truth with the woman I married." Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and quietly removed his cell phone. His thumb hovered above the familiar number for a long moment before he looked back at Emily. Outside, the autumn wind gently stirred the trees beneath the moonlit sky, while inside the small country inn, the next chapter of Ethan's life waited only one unanswered phone call away. For several quiet seconds Ethan stared at the screen of his phone without pressing the call button. The room felt smaller now, not because of fear, but because decades of unanswered questions had finally gathered into a single moment. Emily remained beside him, her hand resting gently over his. She did not urge him to hurry. She understood that some conversations carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Ethan finally pressed the familiar number. The phone rang only once before an older voice answered with calm warmth. "I was wondering when I might hear from you tonight." Ethan smiled faintly. "You remembered?" Judge William Harper gave a soft laugh. "I remembered the date because you asked me to save it many months ago." Ethan glanced toward Emily before speaking again. "She knows there is a story. She knows about the records. I have not shown her everything yet." There was a brief silence before the judge answered. "Then you have already taken the hardest step." Emily could hear the kindness in the older man's voice even from across the table. Judge Harper continued. "May I speak with her?" Ethan handed the phone to his wife without hesitation. Emily accepted it carefully. "Good evening, Judge Harper." "Congratulations on your marriage, Emily," he replied warmly. "I have hoped for this conversation for longer than you can imagine." Emily looked toward Ethan. "He told me almost nothing about his past." "That was never because he wished to deceive you," the judge answered. "It was because I asked him to wait until he found someone who loved the man before learning the history surrounding him." Emily listened quietly. "The young man you married spent his entire adult life asking only one question. If people knew where he came from before they knew his character, would they ever truly know him at all?" Emily felt tears gathering in her eyes. "He never wanted anyone to choose a story instead of choosing him." "Exactly," Judge Harper replied. "That is why I made him promise to build his own life first. Honest work. Honest friendships. Honest love. Only then would the past become a chapter instead of his identity." Emily slowly nodded, although the judge could not see her. Every mystery surrounding Ethan suddenly seemed less like secrecy and more like remarkable patience. Judge Harper continued speaking with the calm certainty of someone who had carried this responsibility for decades. "Inside that box you will find certified court records, original correspondence, and documents that explain how 2 newborn boys were mistakenly placed with the wrong families nearly 38 years ago. The mistake was discovered, but by then several legal complications had already begun. The court ordered every record sealed while investigators confirmed the facts. During those years, lives continued moving forward, and difficult decisions had to be made." Emily held the phone a little tighter. "Did Ethan know when he was a child?" "No," the judge answered gently. "He learned the truth only after he became an adult. By then he had already become the man you know today. He asked for only one thing. He did not ask where wealth might be waiting. He did not ask who his biological relatives were. He asked whether the family who raised him had loved him honestly. When I told him they had, he thanked me and returned to work at the repair shop the very next morning." Emily looked across the table. Ethan sat quietly, listening without interrupting, his expression unchanged. The judge's words sounded exactly like the man she had fallen in love with. He could have spent years chasing a different life. Judge Harper continued. Instead, he chose gratitude over resentment. He believed that love received was more important than opportunities missed. Emily whispered softly. "That sounds exactly like Ethan." "Because that is exactly who he has always been," the judge replied. "The remaining documents will explain how the investigation ended and why I protected them for so many years. But before you read another page, I want you to remember something important. The greatest truth inside that box is not about where Ethan began. It is about the choices he made after learning everything." The call ended a few minutes later with quiet congratulations and a promise that they would meet the following morning. Ethan gently placed the phone back onto the table before looking toward the unopened bundle of legal records tied with the faded blue ribbon. The fire had burned lower now, leaving the room wrapped in gentle amber light. Emily reached for the ribbon but stopped just before touching it. She looked into Ethan's eyes and smiled through tears. "Nothing inside those papers can make me love you more than I already do," she said softly. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment of relief before carefully untying the ribbon, knowing that the next document would reveal the truth he had carried in silence for almost his entire life. With slow, careful movements, Ethan untied the faded blue ribbon that had held the documents together for decades. The paper carried the unmistakable scent of age, and every page had been preserved inside protective sleeves as though someone understood their importance long before Ethan ever touched them. He lifted the first document and placed it gently between himself and Emily. It was an original birth certificate bearing an official county seal. Emily studied the page in silence. The date matched the one Ethan had always celebrated privately. The hospital name was familiar. But halfway down the document, where his family name should have appeared, she saw the same surname engraved on the brass plate attached to the wooden box. It was not Carter. Ethan watched her expression carefully before speaking. The name Carter belongs to the family who raised me. They loved me completely. They never treated me as anything less than their own son. Nothing that happened before I came home with them ever changed that. Emily looked up, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. Ethan reached for the next document. It was an official court order signed decades earlier, confirming that an investigation had verified the accidental exchange of 2 newborn boys shortly after birth. The legal language was formal, but its meaning was unmistakable. Emily slowly covered her mouth as the reality settled in. Ethan had spent his childhood in a loving home, completely unaware that another family somewhere had spent years searching for answers they could never fully understand. He remained silent while she carefully turned each page. Newspaper articles described the confusion surrounding hospital record discrepancies. Investigators interviewed medical staff. Administrators searched incomplete files. Every article stopped before revealing names because the court had ordered complete confidentiality until the investigation concluded. Emily finally looked at the last page resting beneath the others. It contained a handwritten note signed by Judge William Harper years after the case had officially closed. Ethan quietly nodded. "Read that one." Emily lifted the page carefully. The handwriting was immediately familiar after reading the earlier letter. "The truth does not erase the years already lived. It simply explains them." Ethan chose to remain the son of the people who raised him because love had already made that decision long before biology ever could. His biological relatives were informed after every fact had been verified. They asked only one thing of him. They hoped he would meet them when he felt ready, never before. Emily slowly lowered the page. "You knew they wanted to meet you?" Ethan nodded gently. "Yes." "Did you ever go?" He looked toward the fire before answering. "No." Emily frowned, not with disappointment, but with curiosity. "Why?" Ethan smiled softly, though sadness lingered behind his eyes. "Because I spent many years asking myself a question." He paused before continuing. "If I met them before I understood who I already was, would I spend the rest of my life trying to become someone else?" Emily remained completely silent. Ethan folded his hands together on the table. "Judge Harper never pressured me. Neither did they. They respected every decision I made. Every birthday they sent a letter through him. Every Christmas they asked whether I was healthy. Every year I answered only one question." Emily whispered, "What question?" Ethan's voice became almost a whisper. "They always asked whether I had a happy life." Emily felt tears slipping down her cheeks. "And what did you tell them?" Ethan smiled for the first time that evening without sadness. "The truth." He looked around the small room before returning his eyes to hers. "I told them I had parents who loved me, neighbors who cared about me, honest work that gave me purpose, and eventually I told them there was a remarkable woman who made every ordinary day feel like a gift." Emily reached across the table and gently held both of his hands. Ethan continued quietly. "They never asked me to leave my family. They never asked me to change my name. They only wanted to know that the child they lost had become a good man." The room fell silent once more as the fire settled into glowing embers. Outside, the wind brushed softly through the trees, carrying away the final sounds of the wedding celebration. Emily looked once more at the carefully preserved documents spread across the table. They explained where Ethan had begun, but they did not define who he had become. She finally understood why every person in their small town respected him so deeply. They were not honoring a remarkable past. They were honoring the remarkable choices he had made after learning the truth. Ethan gently placed the final document back inside the wooden box before looking toward one unopened envelope that still rested beneath everything else. Unlike the others, it carried no official seal and no court signature. Only a simple handwritten note across the front that read, "For the day you decide whether you are ready to meet us." Emily looked at the final unopened envelope resting inside the wooden box as though it carried the quiet heartbeat of every unanswered year Ethan had lived. Unlike the official records surrounding it, this envelope had been sealed by hand. The paper had softened with age, and the edges showed tiny signs of careful handling, yet the seal itself remained untouched. Ethan gently lifted it into the warm glow of the fireplace before taking a slow breath. "I have carried this with me for almost 20 years, he said softly. "I promised myself I would not open it until I was certain I already knew where home truly was." Emily studied his face. "Do you know now?" Ethan smiled, and for the first time that evening there was no uncertainty behind it. "Yes." He carefully broke the seal and unfolded several handwritten pages. The handwriting differed from Judge Harper's elegant script. It was simpler, warmer, almost hesitant. Ethan quietly began reading. "Dear Ethan, if this letter ever reaches your hands, then it means you are finally ready to decide whether meeting us would bring peace instead of confusion. We have rewritten this letter many times because we never wanted our words to become another burden in your life." Ethan paused briefly before continuing. "The day we learned what happened at the hospital, we wanted nothing more than to hold you. But by then another family had already spent years loving you with everything they had. We realized that taking you away would have healed one broken heart only by breaking another." Emily felt tears quietly filling her eyes once again. Ethan continued reading, his voice calm but deeply moved. "Judge Harper visited us many times through the years. He told us about the boy you were becoming. He spoke about your honesty, your kindness, your willingness to help strangers without expecting anything in return. We celebrated every story as though we had witnessed it ourselves. We missed birthdays, graduations, and ordinary afternoons, but we never stopped being grateful that you were loved." Ethan lowered the page for a moment and stared into the fire. "I never knew they received updates." Emily gently squeezed his hand. "They loved you the only way they were allowed to." Ethan nodded silently before reading the final page. "If one day you decide never to meet us, we will understand completely. The greatest gift we could ever receive is knowing that you built a joyful life. If, however, you choose to open this letter beside someone who loves you, then please thank that person for giving us something we prayed for every single year. The certainty that our son was never truly alone." Ethan slowly folded the letter and placed it beside the other documents. Either of them spoke for several long moments. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful, as though every unanswered question had finally found its place. Emily reached across the table and gently held Ethan's face in her hands. "Now I understand why you waited," she whispered. "You needed to know that I married the mechanic before I ever met this story." Ethan smiled through quiet emotion. "I needed to know that if everything changed tonight, your love would not." Emily shook her head with a tender smile. "Nothing has changed except one thing." Ethan looked at her curiously. "What is that?" She answered without hesitation. "Tonight I learned that kindness is not something you chose after your life became difficult. It is who you decided to become after learning the truth. That is the man I married." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, allowing years of quiet fear to disappear with a single breath. Outside, the autumn wind carried away the last echoes of the wedding celebration, while the stars stretched across the clear country sky. Inside the small inn, surrounded by old letters, court records, and fading photographs, Emily carefully gathered every document and returned them to the wooden box. Then she gently closed the lid and slid it back toward Ethan. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "if your heart is ready, we will meet them together. Not because you need another family to complete your life, but because everyone deserves the chance to say hello after spending so many years saying goodbye in silence. Ethan looked at the woman beside him and realized that the greatest truth revealed that night had never been hidden inside the wooden box at all. It had been quietly waiting across the table in the unwavering heart of the woman who had chosen him long before she ever knew his story. The first light of morning slipped quietly through the curtains of the country inn, filling the room with a soft, golden glow that seemed to wash away the uncertainty of the night before. The wooden box rested peacefully on the small table beside the window, no longer a symbol of hidden questions but a quiet reminder that truth had finally found its place. Ethan woke before sunrise, just as he always had before opening the repair shop. For a few moments he simply watched the early light stretch across the floorboards while listening to the gentle rhythm of Emily's breathing beside him. He smiled to himself, realizing that for the first time in nearly 2 decades there were no unanswered questions left standing between his heart and the person he loved most. When Emily opened her eyes, she found Ethan already making fresh coffee in the small kitchenette. He handed her a warm mug with the same gentle smile that had first captured her heart beside a broken-down car years earlier. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," he said softly. Emily laughed through happy tears. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." She deliberately emphasized the name, and Ethan understood immediately. Of all the documents they had read together, of all the revelations that had changed the meaning of his past, the name he carried with pride was still the one given to him by the parents who had raised him with unconditional love. Nothing inside the wooden box had changed that. Later that morning they drove through quiet country roads toward Judge William Harper's home. Autumn leaves drifted gently across the pavement as sunlight filtered through rows of old maple trees. Either of them spoke very much. They no longer needed to fill every silence with questions because peace had quietly replaced uncertainty. Judge Harper welcomed them onto the front porch before they even reached the steps. His warm smile carried none of the heaviness that had surrounded so many conversations over the years. Instead, it reflected quiet relief. He looked at Ethan for several long moments before saying, "You look lighter today." Ethan smiled. "I finally stopped carrying the story alone." The elderly judge nodded with satisfaction before turning toward Emily. "Thank you?" She looked surprised. "For what?" he answered gently. "For proving that character can be loved before history is understood." They spent nearly 2 hours talking beneath the shade of old oak trees. Judge Harper answered every remaining question with honesty and patience. There were no dramatic discoveries left to uncover, only missing pieces that quietly completed the picture of Ethan's life. Before they left, the judge handed Ethan one final envelope. "You no longer need me to keep this," he said. "The future belongs to you now." Ethan accepted it but did not open it. Instead, he placed it inside the wooden box alongside every other letter that had guided him through the years. Several months passed. Life returned to its familiar rhythm, yet something inside Ethan had quietly changed. He still opened the repair shop every morning before sunrise. He still repaired engines with the same careful hands. He still helped customers who could not afford unexpected repairs. Emily continued teaching second grade, filling her classroom with books, laughter, and encouragement for children discovering the world one lesson at a time. On a bright spring afternoon, a small family picnic took place beneath a wide oak tree in the same town park where Ethan and Emily had often shared quiet lunches. There were no reporters, no speeches, and no grand announcements. 2 families simply sat together around a wooden picnic table, sharing homemade food, old photographs, gentle laughter, and stories that had waited decades to be told. No one tried to reclaim lost years. No one measured love against biology. They simply chose gratitude over regret. As the afternoon sun settled lower across the grass, Ethan watched children chase one another through the park while Emily rested her head gently against his shoulder. He reached for her hand and held it with quiet certainty. The wooden box remained safely stored at home, no longer because it contained secrets, but because it preserved a journey that had finally reached peace. Ethan realized that the greatest inheritance he had ever received was never hidden inside legal records or family names. It had been given to him by every person who chose love over pride, patience over fear, and truth over comfort. Emily smiled as though she had read his thoughts. You know, she whispered, I think your story began long before the hospital made a mistake. Ethan looked at her curiously. When did it begin? She smiled toward the families laughing together beneath the afternoon sunlight. The day you decided that kindness would define your life more than your circumstances ever could. Ethan quietly nodded as a gentle breeze carried laughter through the trees, and in that ordinary moment he understood that some families begin with birth, others begin with choice, but the strongest ones are built one act of love at a time, because the truest home is never the place where life begins, it is the place where hearts choose to remain.